what everyone thinks of the Tories. Can you imagine Sir Alec Douglas-Hume, who was Tory leader the year I was born, in the early 1960s, being a member of United Against Fascism? Can you imagine that? He would think that they were persons who needed a wash. And when Alec Douglas-Hume, who was regarded as being very, quote-unquote, out of touch, was asked on the equivalent of Panorama in 1963, what do you think of the recent rise in unemployment? He said, raising a stick, he said, oh, well, there's room for a new gamekeeper on my estate. That was when the Tories were something different, weren't they, really? He was quite clearly living in another world to most of the people in this country, even in the early 1960s. But can you imagine him being, like Cameron, a member of United Against Fascism? I saw a few pictures at the Red, White and Blue, which happened in Derbyshire a couple of weeks back in this year, of United Against Fascism. And it's very odd. The first thing I noticed about them is a new generation has emerged. The second thing I noticed is that they were very small in number. The third thing I noticed was that they all had red flags massed together in their sort of paucity of numbers. And many of those flags had the hammer and sickle on them. The hammer and sickle, yes. We haven't seen that for a long time, have they? You know, and what does that stand for? Militant egalitarianism, the destruction of Western society, the death to everything that this country once stood for, the desecration of what people basically fought in both of those wars that I mentioned earlier. This is what the sort of communism that these people stand for is about. So when people look at these sorts of sites and listen to this sort of propaganda, they ought to remember that this is communist propaganda that is opposed to everything this country has ever stood for and has been and can be in the future. And these people are totally unrepresentative. As I sort of looked on the internet in a local library, I saw various transvestites and people in bondage gear and this sort of thing leaping about. I thought I'd put in Liza Minnelli's Cabaret by mistake, but in actual fact it was United Against Fascism down in Derbyshire, with the police looking tight-lipped, you know, as they sort of danced around them. And interestingly, there's the odd sort of quite believing Muslim in the crowd, not many, but there were a few. What they make of these sorts of shenanigans, about which their religion is extraordinarily right-wing and intolerant, one doesn't know. They probably compartmentalise it and say it's all a sort of delinquent Western funfair that they're just observing from one side. But the truth of the matter is that, to be serious for a moment, we have a mass recession. We have mass unemployment. And where is the left? Where is the left? The left that represents the working man. The left that represents the British working class. The left that represents the international proletariat. Inside Britain in the 30s, they were in the streets. They were in the unions. They were thinking about how they could take power in the society. Every time you had an economic dip in the early 90s to a degree, in the early 80s under Thatcher, remember the right to work marches? Right to work. Many of the people on those marches never done a day's work in their lives, but they wanted the right to work, and they could mass tens of thousands in the streets. Where are they now? They're finished. The left has gone from history. The Soviet Union was an utter disaster. A genocidal disaster. And nobody, even radicals who are anti-system in the West, wants to touch them now. The only way in which they can be radical is to oppose us. Because the next 20 to 50 years will see the rise of the right in various forms all over the world, in all groups. What we have to make sure is that the right that comes up in our society represents us and our values and our traditions, because we know who we are. We don't need laws to describe who we are. We don't need little a priori prejudicial statements which prevent us from saying what we are. We know who we are. Kipling once said, the English deep down know who they are, the English that only the English know. And we know what we are, we know what we've been capable of, we know what we can do again. Nearly all of our people agree with us in a subtle way, but they're afraid. They're afraid, their establishment has betrayed them, and they wonder what to do. They feel helpless and bereft. An organisation like this has to lift people up, it has to give them strength and hope in their hearts. This country can be changed, only the democratic ballot box can do it. The next census will reveal that the country is only 80% indigenous now. But many of the people who've come in can go out economically as quickly as they arrived. Things are going to change in the next 25 to 50 years very radically. Ecological damage, economic stress, the collapse of versions of capitalism without the left as a safety net and an alternative. We're going to see benefits cut in the next couple of years. We're going to see the easy years, if they were easy, and they weren't for many, in the 60s and 70s go. The idea that there are jobs to be had is going. There's 200 apply for every McDonald's job now. That's a job paying $5.65 to flip over an American burger that makes you obese and die of a coronary before you're 60. And 200 are applying for each of those jobs. And probably about a quarter of them aren't European. So there's underneath the surface of Sky News and Happy Clappy and Amy Winehouse snorting drugs, under the surface of that, there's a great tension in this society. And there's a great sense of foreboding. Deep polling by the BBC thinks that many people are deeply worried. Worried that there'll be conflict in this culture. Worried that there's no one to lead them. Worried about the collapse of our identity in various forms. And we are in considerable collapse. You don't have to go around many of our cities. You notice the decay in the infrastructure. You notice the amounts of blatant criminality. Where are the police? Do you see the police as they drive around in their cars and they fly over cities in their numbered helicopters? They're all dressed in yellow now, so you can see them from a distance. But they're firemen. They come at the end. They come after it's kicked off. They get out of the wagon when people are lying on the ground. They come at the end, not at the beginning. They just to put it out and dampen it down. They see their remit as partly preventing inter-community tension rather than solving crime and dealing with some of the gangs that I've talked about proliferating in inner Birmingham and elsewhere. So this country's in trouble. And Cameron has no solutions at all. He will cut public expenditure, and because they don't like spending money, the Tories will be a little bit more honest about that. But they will invest in wars like the coming one that might occur over Iran, and the one that's already petering out into oblivion and defeat, like the one in the 1890s before it in Afghanistan. He says he's against the European Union, but will you have a vote on any of these treaties? At the last election, Brown said he would give us a vote on that constitution, and he's completely reneged. So yet another lie from the man who said he would be straight. Do you remember when he came in? He said, "Look at me," he said, "I'm Gordon Brown, and I know the way he speaks. And I'm going to be sincere with you," with his head on one side. You know? Every time I see Gordon Brown, he looks older. One eye's up here, one eye's down here. The hair gets whiter and greyer. The chins get more pulled to the left. He looks sadder and more alone, doesn't he? Every time you see him, you know he's a man in decline. New Labour has had it. Old Labour died before 97, and New Labour's now in the dustbin. New Labour's probably as hated now as Major was in 97. But our people have got to stop moaning and switching from group to group and hoping that somebody new and cheesy like Blair, back 10 years, will sort it out for them. They've got to choose something new. They've got to choose something radical. They've got to cease being afraid. You say to people, "Oh, will you vote for this party over there?" And they say, "Oh, no. They're extreme. I didn't like what I read about them in the Daily Mirror. I didn't like about this remark that this chap made about historical events that are 60 years old. I'm worried. I want to go and sit on the toilet." You know? A lot of our people, unfortunately, are like this. The spirit of the sort of egg frying on the sort of North African tank in the 8th Army in the early 40s has unfortunately receded a bit. But deep down, it's because the English and the British have been betrayed. They've always wanted to moan a bit, but otherwise trust their leaders, and they realise now they can't trust their leaders. If this country is to have any future, and we are not to slide into the second and then into the third world over this century, we have a choice to make. And we have to find a new ruling group, drawn from the body of the population, people who don't just get into Parliament so they can cheat on expenses the first day they're in there, because they've been cheating with those expenses for 30 to 50 years. Thatcher introduced those changes in the about 25 to 27 to 30 years ago. When Michael Foot was asked about pay, remember Michael Foot? Duffel-coated at the cenotaph and that sort of thing, picking his nose, that sort of thing. But when Foot was in and Labour politicians said, "I need a bigger salary," he said, "Oh, don't bother about that, just claim it on expenses." So they doubled up their pay on the expenses. And in comparison to the cheating over money that goes on in the City of London, that parliamentary cheating is actually small beer. It's their resentment over that and those sorts of things that leads them to behave in that way. So there's a total disconnect now between the ruling group and the masses. And the masses have got to serve some stomach for once. And they've got to be prepared to vote for radical people who will clear out New Labour, clear them out. Here in the north,